Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. The forum today is devoted to the subject of Xinjiang, and I want to remind any of you who are not regularly receiving our invitations to make sure that you've left with us your cards so we can invite you, include you in the future. This topic is by no means new to the Central Asia Caucasus Institute. Beginning actually 12 years ago, we organized the best American and other scholars working on that region and produced a book that you may have seen, Xinjiang, China's Muslim Borderland, which is still available. Still in print. They keep printing more copies. And from Emmy Sharp, this book it took a very long-term view. It did not get too deep into contemporary and very sensitive political matters, and in general took a highly, I would say, sort of lofty and scholarly view rather than a highly polemical and political view. Nonetheless, elements of the Chinese government, we learned eventually that this was done entirely by the intelligence people, banned the authors of the book, a good group of very fine Western scholars, banned them from entry into China, which has still never been lifted officially. Rather disappointing. We've had unofficial apologies from many high-ranking Chinese saying that this is done by the intelligence and not by the foreign ministry or others, and I certainly accept those at face value. I personally have been invited many times to China recently, and I'm grateful for that. But I think the response, at least of the Chinese intelligence to this book, indicates the great sensitivity and importance that the government assigns to this issue, and for understandable reasons. We have not, in the Central Asia Caucasus Institute, undertaken any more recent major research projects on Xinjiang, although we do regularly cover it in our Central Asia Caucasus Institute Analyst, cacianalyst.org. And those of you in the room, among whom are several I know are doing very good work in this area, we invite you to become a contributor to the analyst and get your word on your research out that way. Now, a month or so ago, attending a meeting here in town, I met Ben Chang, who is our speaker. My prejudice in his favor is very great because he graduated just a while back from Princeton, where I spent 10 years on the faculty. And he is now, however, an analyst for the long-term strategy group here in town. And his graduate studies were focused on international affairs, which he did at the Woodrow Wilson School. And he has written papers for the National Security Council staff, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, and the EU Commissioner for Home Affairs, among other bodies. Now, he reported at the gathering, very small gathering that I alluded to, at the long-term strategy group, on his research on Xinjiang and its relationship to the policy strategies of the government in Beijing. And on that basis, I immediately invited him to come and speak here. I think you'll find him a very engaging and well-informed speaker, and I suspect by the end of our session here, you'll be exhausted. Ben, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi. Good evening for those wondering about my age. Since I look like I'm 12, no worries, I'm actually 8. Thanks to Dr. Starr for that generous introduction, as well as to the Central Asia Caucasus Institute for having me. Before I begin, standard caveat, everything I say should be construed as only my own opinion, not the opinion of the Long-Term Strategy Group, the US government, or anyone other than myself. Do you have the pointer?
Do you have the pointer?
Yes, I do have it. Okay, excellent. So this that you see on the slide here is actually the official Chinese Xinhua News map of the New Silk Road. As you can see, it's pretty. As you can see, it's pretty extensive. So it stretches from Xi'an all the way west, terminating at Rotterdam, before looping down through Athens and Nairobi in Kenya, past South and Southeast Asia, eventually ending up on China's eastern industrialized coast. And so recently it was Xi Jinping announced that there would be a $40 billion Silk Road fund in order to build the infrastructure required for manifesting these trade lines. And in addition, there was also a $50 billion capitalization of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is, many people think, will take a very active role in funding these various investments. And at least one paper, the One China Times, estimates that the total realized economic value of this entire pathway, were it to be materialized, would be on the order of $21.1 trillion. So obviously, it's an enormous undertaking, and a lot of people are comparing it to the United States Marshall Plan. So the question is what to make of this, and there's several hypotheses. One, for example, is that it's purely for economic or commercial ends. It's an extension of China's go-out policy of increasing outward directed investment, and Xi Jinping in particular claims that there will be $1.25 trillion in outward investment over the next 10 years, which would be a staggering figure if it were at all close to true. Another interpretation is most prominently advocated by Chinese academic Wang Jise, and he argues that China in fact recognizes that it's engaged more and more, or being drawn into, a zero-sum competition with the United States and East Asia over the maritime territorial disputes. So it wants to pivot, do its own pivot to continental Central Asia, and therefore create a more positive sum relationship with the United States over issues like counterterrorism, energy and non-proliferation, regional stability, etc. And the United States has signaled that it's presently in favor of this direction of Chinese policy. In fact, the New Silk Road was an initiative coined and invented by Hillary Clinton, and it's sort of a Chinese appropriation of an original U.S. initiative name. I want to make a alternative third interpretation of these Chinese moves, which I'm sure some of you will disagree with, so I welcome a hearty debate afterwards, which is that Chinese policy in this area is actually intended at establishing regional geopolitical predominance, with means that are, when necessary, either violent or coercive, and are against U.S. interests. And so to argue for this hypothesis, I'm going to talk about Xinjiang and then Central Asia in turn. More could be said on South Asia, Middle East, Southeast Asia, etc., but for the purposes of today, I will limit myself. And you might be asking why talk about Xinjiang in an argument about foreign policy. Obviously, Xinjiang is a fully incorporated part of China. But I think there's a couple reasons that Xinjiang might serve as a useful parallel by which to examine China's foreign policy. First, it's arguably a good indicator of Chinese behavior towards foreign states, insofar as since China doesn't regard Xinjiang as fully incorporated, it's often referred to as a restive province, etc., that some of its policies towards Xinjiang mirror those towards states that are not entirely under its control, i.e. foreign states. Secondly, I'm going to make the argument later that China may use Xinjiang and particular events in Xinjiang as a basis for justifying further movement into Central Asia, so it's interesting in that regard. And thirdly and finally, it's obviously an important gateway for resources that China may choose to import from Central Asia. 83% of Chinese trade with Central Asia passes through Xinjiang. And so for each section, in terms of Xinjiang and Central Asia, I'm going to talk about first the Chinese public line, and then what I think is happening on an actual geostrategic level. So in Xinjiang, I'm going to talk about first the Chinese goal of stability, and then the Chinese goal of growth. So in terms of stability, the primary counterterrorism cooperation with the United States actually began after 9/11, when they passed this intelligence on what they call the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, or ETIM for short, which they alleged had links to Al Qaeda and other Central Asian terrorist movements. And in particular, they said that there were 200 incidents of activity, terrorist activity by ETIM between 1980 and 2001, and in 2002 they claimed to have prevented an attack on the U.S. Embassy in Bishkek. So we agreed, actually, with this assessment at the time. We froze ETIM's assets. We classed them as a terrorist group under the Patriot Act, and we pushed for various UN resolutions to help freeze their assets. And obviously, this counterterrorism cooperation has continued notably to the or has reemerged notably in the present day. China has signaled that it is generally on board with U.S. anti-ISIS efforts, which a lot of observers were surprised by, because normally China has previously taken a firm stance against any kind of intervention of foreign states on the basis of sovereignty. So how can I argue, or how should we interpret this? Well, I want to argue actually that China is not really afraid of the Uyghurs as sort of a genuine threat of concern to the Chinese state. In fact, I want to argue that China is strategically exaggerating the threat to it of ETIM and Uyghur unrest in general for strategic ends. And I know that's fairly provocative, so what evidence do I have for this thesis? Well, first is that if you look at mass incident data, which is data about things like riots, protests, etc., which China itself stopped releasing in 2005, but which a number of institutes such as RAND, etc., still continue to track through various scholars, it seems that Xinjiang incidents are actually not the most common. So, for example, some studies have found that there are more mass incidents in eastern industrialized China than in Xinjiang itself. For reference, in 2010, one professor noted that there were approximately 180,000 incidents of mass incidents in China. And in particular, the reason that we view in the West Xinjiang as the most restive province may, at least in part, be due to Chinese control over information. So 180,000, you can do the math. There are many such incidents every day, and the one that China chooses to publicize or to give the most attention, maybe those in Xinjiang. The second thing is this is a graph, or a chart rather, of incidents of the appearance of the terms Uyghur separatists and Uyghur terrorists in Chinese and English from 1980 to 2004. And two things are very notable about this graph. First is that the terms are, the appearance of the terms is concentrated in 2001 and afterwards, which is really unusual if you were to buy the Chinese claim that there were 200 incidents of terrorist activity between 1980 and 2001. In other words, why didn't they report on those incidents as they were happening, but those were only reported after 2001? And the second thing is that, as you can see, clearly these terms are concentrated in English. The vast majority of these search results are for English. So it seems that perhaps this was sort of deliberately put out by someone or other for deliberate Western consumption. And the third thing is that a lot of the intelligence we have about ETIM is of dubious sourcing. Since the United States obviously doesn't maintain a native intelligence network in Xinjiang, a lot of it was of Chinese origin. For example, a Congressional Research Service report actually found that a lot of the internet messages and websites that were previously attributed to ETIM seem to have been fabricated either by China or by other third parties for whatever reason. In fact, a lot of Western experts had not heard of ETIM when China released this report in 2002, and the reaction by some was, what, are they even real? And maybe most damningly, the same CRS report did a review of Chinese literature and could find zero mentions of ETIM before 9/11, which obviously would be almost impossible in terms of looking at the Chinese literature if there were indeed 200 attacks between 1980 and 2001. And obviously the last piece of evidence would be what happened at Guantanamo, which is when we detained 22 Uyghurs who were ultimately cleared of charges. If you look at the DC Circuit Court decision on the Combatant Status Review Tribunal, it found that all of the intelligence that we had used to classify them as enemy combatants was in fact of Chinese origin, and that there was no reliable external validation of this classification. And so it seems to me that, at least in part, or at least historically in this case, China deliberately exaggerated what it viewed were as ETIM or other Uyghur movements for various purposes. And obviously the most obvious counter-argument to this that you might be thinking of now is, well, doesn't China really fear Uyghurs? Isn't it sort of the most often cited threat of internal ethnic unrest? Well, I want to make a distinction here between Chinese strategists who work at the national level and local, maybe police force, PAP, etc., or local officials who may genuinely have a fear based on ethnic lines. But I think that at the level of national strategy, what I want to argue is that the Uyghur secession threat is not high up on the threats of great concern list. And there's a couple of reasons I think this is the case. The first is that China has been very successful in sealing off Xinjiang as a society. Translations and publications of books in Xinjiang are all effectively monitored by the state. There are no non-state imams, so all imams have to pass patriotic education classes in order to preach in Xinjiang. And in 1996, China successfully signed extradition agreements with Central Asian states so that Uyghurs that were pursuing would be extradited back to China. The second reason is that there has been an effective, serious a policy of cultural erasure. Around every 10 years or so, China has cyclically switched the language in which instruction is carried out in Xinjiang, which means that a lot of the generations of Uyghurs have trouble talking to each other, and of course, over 50% of Uyghurs are illiterate. So it's hard for them to read their history or have a coherent movement. And the final thing is that I think China just possesses an advantage in terms of overwhelming force vis-a-vis the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs have no large-scale organization. They have no real foreign backing, and in externally confirmed attacks by the Uyghurs, they're reported as using extremely crude improvised weapons. And you might say, well, there's so many of them. It's the ethnic majority there. Don't they have the advantage? But actually, since the Chinese state has pushed deliberate migration of Han to the region, at least as of 2010, it was 46% Uyghur and 40% Han. So even that advantage is quickly eroding. So what if I'm right about what China's doing with this policy, what do they get from this? And I think they get a few things. The first is that they can counter what they see as an ideological weapon of the West, which is human rights criticism. So this isn't just China not liking the sound of us criticizing them. Rather, if you read Chinese literature, it seems that a lot of their view of how the West beat the Soviet Union was by sort of tricking them into liberalizing or tricking them into implementing glasnost and perestroika, and as a result, the Soviet Union may have collapsed. So to them, it's a real threat to regime stability. The second is that it may be a means by which to justify expansionism. So some people say that China's Central Asian interests grow out of Xinjiang. I think it's at least as likely that China may use Xinjiang as a way to justify increased or expanded Central Asian interests. For example, in the Peace Mission 2009 PRC Russian joint military exercise, PLA Chief of General Staff Chen Bingde actually advocated for deploying the PLA to Central Asia in order to fight ETIM. And this is also something that was argued for in the 2014 Shanghai Cooperation Organization Yellow Book. And the third benefit that I think China gains from this policy is sabotaging U.S. foreign policy. And there's two parts to this. The first is that we obviously took a major hit to international and domestic credibility when the whole Uyghur debacle happened. And second is that China, I think, has always feared the collusion of internal and external enemies, historically speaking. And so by effectively alienating the formerly pro-U.S. Uyghurs, who they were very pro-U.S., they actually saw us as sort of maybe perhaps their best hope for defense against their human rights abuses by the Chinese government, it removes one potential lever or button that the United States might push in a future altercation. And so obviously this is all relevant today in terms of ISIS. And the question is, have we learned? Because academic scholarship, if you look at it now, is still rife with references to ETIM threat and how China perceives that threat in particular. For example, recently Obama pushed a number of UN resolutions in order to encourage states to prevent members of their population from joining ISIS, to take various anti-radicalization steps, etc. And Russia and China were very much in favor of this. In fact, they encouraged making the parts of the resolutions more strict. And so I think to a degree it's still inarguable that they're using this threat as a cover for some domestic abuses. And obviously the question is it a genuine threat to China, that is Uyghur cooperation with ISIS? For example, al-Baghdadi released a video in which he said he wanted to expand his campaign into China. The Iraqi Ministry of Defense also posted a picture of an operative they had captured that appeared to be of Chinese descent. But at least as of recently, there hasn't been independent open source verification of the Chinese claim that 100 Uyghurs are working with ISIS, and the United States should help with that process. Okay, so now I want to talk about the second policy area of China in Xinjiang, which is growth. And obviously, publicly, it stems from the 2001 Western Development Strategy that these relatively impoverished inland regions should also be brought in line to grow equally with the rest of China, Uyghurs having been sort of left behind by a lot of Chinese economic gains. And materially, this is translated into tens of billions of dollars for housing, industrial development, employment, etc. And then there was, of course, the $23 billion high-speed rail line from Lanzhou to Urumqi. But I want to argue that actually a lot of Chinese concerns in this area are not about the Uyghurs or economic equality per se, but about resource security in general. And how can I argue this? Well, first, if you look at the Uyghurs, they actually are suffering extraordinary inequality. So only 50% of Uyghurs even have education of an equivalent level of elementary school. Large-scale sociological statistics are unavailable because the Chinese government doesn't like people to do research in that area. But from the literature that is available, it seems that Uyghurs have an income that is around 50% or less than that of Han. So it's hard to imagine that China has tried genuinely very hard to improve Uyghur livelihoods, which is also the case if you look at where the specific targeted investments are going. The second thing is the presence of the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. So it's nominally a state vehicle for supplying labor, but I think it's actually more akin to what you might characterize as an occupying force. So it's 2.7 million personnel, or 12% of the total population of Xinjiang. It's drawn from PLA forces stationed in the west. Some of these contingents actually date back to the Civil War, and it constantly maintains a military that is 120,000 strong. So they control things like the labor supply to major farms, factories, and mines, and that shows the areas that are effectively run by the XPCC. And the total area, if you add all that up, is around 70,000 square kilometers, or an area double the size of Taiwan with a GDP of $24.2 billion. And effectively what they have here is a state within a state. So the XPCC has their own schools, courts, police, prisons, hospitals, and so on, and also often operates as an arm of state investment. So it has stakes in hundreds of companies and also often brokers deals with foreign agents. Now, why is the XPCC deployed in this fashion? Well, I think that there's a number of resources in Xinjiang that are critically important to China. The first being farmland. So 3.1 million hectares of arable land are present and being currently cultivated in Xinjiang, and there's an additional 4.9 million that have yet to be cultivated. In macro terms, China obviously has around a fifth of the world's population, but only around 8% of the world's farmland, and they're 42nd in the Global Food Security Index, just behind Venezuela. And this, in fact, is a distortion graph of global grain demand, where the country's sizes are in proportion to their share of global demand. And China actually used to be a net exporter of rice for around 50 years, but since 2006 has had around a 17 million ton grain per annum rise due to mainly the rise in per capita income in China. And in 2012, this actually pushed the world grain price to an all-time high. So China also has long had a self-sufficiency policy where they try to grow as much grain as they can within their borders, probably due to the historical memory of repeated disastrous famines over the last 150 years, obviously the most recent one being the Great Leap Forward. And given that China also has a long history of peasant revolutions, I don't think it's unreasonable to argue that China thinks of Xinjiang and its resources, therefore with an especially sensitive eye to that aspect of it. The second thing is that there's also a lot of fuel in Xinjiang. There's 40% of total coal reserves, which is 60% of China's total energy profile, 13% of current Chinese crude oil output, 34% of estimated natural gas, and 30% of the current output. And obviously, it's also going to be a key transit corridor for energy that China would want to draw from Central Asia. And finally, in terms of minerals, there's 78% of all minerals in China are in fact in Xinjiang, including critical defense materials like beryllium, which is an aerospace material in satellites, missiles, and aircraft, and precursors for steel and various other materials. So I think one scenario also that's worth mentioning here is with regard to the XPCC, is that how might China expand the XPCC or move into more the security realm in Central Asia is that right now the XPCC functions as a lot of worker protection for ethnic Han against Uyghurs in terms of its paramilitary forces. And given that a lot of Chinese construction projects are abroad, are staffed by Chinese workers, I think that is one scenario by which you might see expansion of Chinese security presence abroad, especially since the XPCC already operates as China's broker for a lot of foreign investments. Okay, so now I want to move to talking about Central Asia, and I'll also mention the role of Russia here. Obviously, there's been a lot of recent investment, diplomacy, growth of security institutions, normally the EU, the SCO, the CSTO, etc. And I want to talk about first the role of energy, and then the role of regional influence in general. So in the role of energy, I think most generally China touts sort of its non-oil and gas investments as proof that it's a good neighbor and it seeks a kind of harmonious regional integration. And to be fair, there has been a genuine economic boom. There's $30 billion of investment to Kazakhstan, $15 billion to Uzbekistan, and $3 billion to Kyrgyzstan, etc. But I actually want to argue that escaping U.S. sea lane control in pursuit of energy security is a primary Chinese strategic goal in this area. And how can I argue that? Well, first of all, they say so. So this is a Chinese visualization of what one Chinese visualization of what a U.S. blockade might look like, and that's 封锁中国方面, which is just the plan to blockade China, and you have a two-line blockade envisioned with the white line being the distant blockade, and then the dotted red line being the close blockade within the island chains. And this is obviously just one example, but if you look at the literature, whether that's the Global Times or the international relations literature in Chinese language journals or the energy literature in Chinese language journals, it's a constant refrain that there's a fear of a United States blockade. And the second is strategic rationality. I mean, it would be strategically irrational not to consider this possibility. China had a 59% import dependency for crude oil in 2013, which is easily apparent from looking at the sources of China's crude oil imports, and this will continue to grow. 90% of China's crude oil travels by sea, and 80% of that passes through the Strait of Malacca. So clearly there's a substantial strategic worry here for China. And the third data point in favor of this is that China has maintained a high level of state control over its national oil companies. And they haven't privatized the industry in the same way that they have liberalized some other places. So I think it's hard to argue that Chinese energy investment decisions are taken with only commercial goals in mind, given that there's still coordination with the central state organs. And finally, I think, and maybe this is the most compelling point against the hypothesis that all of China's investment abroad is just for commercial ends, is that China's investment in this sphere has actually been very unprofitable. So in 2013, for example, PetroChina reported a $6 billion loss despite making sales of 41.5 billion cubic meters of gas. And that's because due to low demand and price, it's actually not profitable to import natural gas, especially into relatively unpopulated areas of China. And a good example of this is the agreement they have with Myanmar. So they have a pipeline that they purchase natural gas at 2.7 yuan per cubic meter, and then they sell it in China at between 3.3 and 4.7 yuan per cubic meter. But it costs 3 yuan to import a cubic meter. So it's never profitable to actually import and sell the gas. And in general, this is true. Central Asian pipelines for China actually operated below 50% capacity in 2013. They were deliberately suppressed below maximum operating levels. And even with that, they still suffered a $7 billion operating loss. So to me, that suggests a strategic logic to these investments rather than a definite commercial interest. So how are they carrying out this strategy then, if I'm right, of securing insulation from a U.S. blockade? Well, the first is obviously overland routes. You can't blockade a pipeline by land. But it's also the case that it introduces third-party territory into the equation. So, it's a fixed asset. That's a pipeline. You can strike it by air, etc. But if it's passing through, say, Kazakhstan, then the United States might think twice about getting involved. And if you look at Russian and Kazakh pipelines, they could meet up to 6% of total Chinese oil demand in 2020 as projected by the EIA. And if you look at the technical capacity of those pipelines, so surge capacity, they could reach up to 12%. There's also estimates of strategic stockpiling of oil by China, which will reach approximately 90 days by 2020. And so one Naval War College study actually finds that with harsh domestic rationing, indigenous production, and non-absolute blockade enforcement, China might actually be able to sustain a U.S. attempt at blockading oil for a couple of years. And I also want to talk about natural gas for a moment, because I think this is pretty important, even though it's currently a relatively low percent, around 6% of China's total energy consumption profile. China is aggressively moving its economy towards one that consumes natural gas. They're subsidizing shale. They're subsidizing the gas price. It was subsidized by 18% this past August, for example. And they've also planned the retirement of a number of coal-fired plants. And obviously, part of that is it's better for less pollution, it's cleaner, etc. But also, it helps with the defending against the U.S. blockade. And that's because the reason that the oil price is global, so there's a single price globally for oil, is because oil travels on tankers and is redirected for wherever the demand is. But gas doesn't operate this way. There's a local price for natural gas because it's primarily transported among pipelines, and so it doesn't have that global kind of liquidity, no pun intended. And so a economy that shifts towards mainly consuming natural gas will end up with a tangle of local pipelines that are harder to blockade as opposed to one that rely on crude oil. So yes, there are environmental benefits, but there are also compelling strategic benefits for China. And the second thing is obviously there are also growing overland routes for China in terms of natural gas. Russia plus Central Asia, that adds up to about 42% of China's natural gas in 2020 as currently projected, and up to 60% of that total capacity if you look at the technical surge capacities of the various pipelines and not just what's currently been contracted. And obviously, as I'm sure you're all aware, recently there's been revived talk of also having the Altai pipeline running into western China with Russia. And so the interesting thing about that pipeline in particular is that that shifts gas that's already contracted to Europe to China. So that's definitely a geopolitical move and not something that's just based on commercial logics. And if China can make use of this, then it's obviously a more secure energy than oil. So this is the, as you heard about, the $400 billion deal earlier through Siberia. And this is what I just talked about, which is the directed towards that little bit of China that emerges between Kazakhstan and Mongolia. So this hasn't happened yet, but they actually just signed a accord to reach a specific agreement on prices and the details of construction by the first half of 2015. I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen, but it's definitely something to watch. So why does all this matter? Why am I talking about Chinese energy security? Well, I think it matters in at least two respects. The first is that China may have a substantially emboldened strategic posture vis-a-vis the United States if it can achieve substantial energy security against the threat of a U.S. blockade. So the present American threat to Chinese energy security, I would argue, is an important check on Chinese assertiveness. For example, the Carnegie Endowment estimates that we could contract their economy by $883 billion in the first year of a blockade, or around 12.6% of their 2011 GDP. In particular, it's important because of the nature of a likely Sino-American conflict. Some people argue, for example, that it's a vital step in the escalation ladder to have the option of a blockade between a limited conventional and an unlimited nuclear conflict, on the other hand. And it's hard to win a protracted conflict without favorable trend lines, given that, say if it was in the East or South China Sea, then we would be not at home and they would have sort of the home field advantage, as it were. So we would have costs imposed on us over time because of things like supply lines, while China would just be safe at home. So a blockade would give the United States the means to impose costs on China over time as the conflict progressed. So the blockade, therefore, may be a vital tool in a conflict of that nature. Okay, so now I want to talk about Chinese influence in the area. And publicly, obviously, as I stated before, a lot of Chinese academics, not just Wang Jisi, but in fact this is the official Chinese line of some state ministers, and so on, argue that pivoting to Central Asia is an act of de-escalation vis-a-vis the United States, that this heralds a new era potentially of cooperation and less zero-sum conflict as we've seen in East Asia. But I actually want to argue that it's not a pivot away from assertiveness in East Asia, but actually just an expansion of assertiveness to Central Asia, and in particular that China may view Central Asia as a kind of buffer zone vis-a-vis the United States. And the first piece of evidence from this is that China has had a hand in, or has been very happy with, the eviction of us from all our major Central Asian bases. So in 2005, for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization issued a demand for withdrawal of actually all foreign bases, but the sort of endpoint of that was that in 2005 you also saw our eviction by Uzbekistan after we criticized their response to peaceful civilian protests. And this year, 2014, we finished withdrawing from Manas, which was our last major base in the area. Notably, right near our base in Manas, there is also a Russian base which is rent-free. So in both cases, there's some evidence to suggest that China pushed these decisions, or at least encouraged them, or it was strongly in favor of them, and that China may have argued, for example, as it does in its own literature, that the United States was behind the color revolutions, and so Central Asia should really try to kick the United States out while it still can. And another data point in favor of this interpretation is that a lot of Chinese activity in this area is also likely unprofitable. So a Chinese trade link through Central Asia it probably will require a lot of upfront capital investments that will take a loss for a long time, because presently 99% of commodity trade between Asia and Europe is by sea, and there are very strong structural reasons for this. The first is there's very difficult terrain, things like landslides, high mountains, snow, etc. And also secondly, because of very difficult governments. For example, there are visa regimes that are so convoluted they require the truck driver to change at each border, or the border post hours are not synced up, and there's obviously the problem of local corruption. And more fundamentally, for example, there are track gauge differences between Europe and the former Soviets, and then between the former Soviets and China. Ship container storage is generally larger than that of trucks, and there are very established sea routes that will get your stuff there at a predetermined and set amount of time. So it's likely not to be very economically viable to attempt to establish a functional trade route through Central Asia, at least in the short term. And Dr. Starr may disagree with me on this. And so I think that at least you can see that these investments pertain to strategic logics rather than logics of what is best for money making. And finally, I want to make a claim that I think will probably draw hearty disagreement, and so I look forward to the debate afterwards, and in which I think that it's 65-35 at least, that China and Russia will actually find a way to cooperate in the long term over Central Asia. And I want to split my argument into structural factors, regional factors, and then contingent factors. So structurally speaking, I think China and Russia, most people would agree, have similar macro desires. They would prefer multipolarity, they would prefer a shift away from the dollar as a global reserve currency, and they would prefer a shift away from US global dominance, which they perceive as deliberately containing both of them. And they also have similar existences. They're both authoritarian, self-perceived survivors of the color revolutions. They have relatively controlled economies, and so you could say they're sort of fellow autocratic survivors of the Fukuyaman end of history, is one way you might put it. Also in the region specifically, arguably they have pretty similar top-level interests. So they prefer authoritarianism in the region. They want to maintain the domestic stability of the former Soviet, and they would prefer a lack of US presence and influence. For example, the SCO often issues counterstatements to OSCE electoral reports. And I actually think that it's a possibility, and a pretty likely one, that Russia recognizes that to a degree it can't really counter effectively the creep of Chinese influence in Central Asian states. And so it knows that it will be forced to accept a kind of modus vivendi and accept a division of labor insofar as Russia will be the provisioner of security and China will operate in the area of economics. Chinese cash is sort of just too much for Russia at the present moment. For example, $27 billion of investment by Russia versus $46 billion by China in 2012. And accepting the Chinese deal, at least in the short term, stems the loss of Central Asian influence by giving it a way to negotiate with China, and while it gets other gains. And that brings me to the contingent factors argument, which is that there have been a lot of emergency investments by China into the specific assets that Western sanctions have targeted in Russia. You may have heard recently that there are projections that the Russian economy may fall into depression starting early next year, obviously not only because of the sanctions, but also because of problems with oil prices. But still, it's pretty compelling if you look at the specific list of Chinese emergency infusions of cash, Gazprom, Lukoil, Megafund, VTB Bank, the Russian Agriculture Bank, etc. These are hundreds of millions of dollars in addition to a $25 billion currency swap of propping up the specific sanction targets that were hurt by Western policy actions. And not to mention, of course, the $400 billion in gas, the discussion over the Altai pipeline, etc. And the fact that also trade is spiking. So it was $88 billion in 2013 between China and Russia, and there are some projections that it might go up to $200 billion in 2020. So there's a large amount of short-term cushion in which Russia relies on China in order to counter the effects of its alienation from the West. And in particular, most recently, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu announced that there would be joint naval exercises between China and Russia in the Mediterranean next year. In the Mediterranean, think about that. It's pretty crazy. And he also announced that the two nations sought a collective regional security system. So obviously you might think of a couple of counter-arguments to this hypothesis. First is, what about the Great Game? But I actually think that there's a number of shifts in the short term that show that, maybe at least this might be suppressed for the present moment. For example, there's an upward trend in weapons sales to China in terms of selling better stuff, in terms of various Russian sources being quoted, and obviously weapons sales with Russia are never certain, but this is definitely one indicator to watch. Secondly, there's been a shift in the way the SCO behaves. So the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in 2008, for example, as I'm sure you're all aware, famously condemned or was less than lukewarm about Russia and Georgia, but in 2014 the statement seemed to be much more positive on Russian activity in Ukraine. So that's a notable shift. And also, if you review Russian and Chinese sources over the most recent period of time, it seems that they've been a distinct qualitative shift towards being more in favor of a strategic Sino-Russian alignment. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, what about the longer term? Maybe this particular series of contingent factors brings them together, but what about the longer term? Isn't there sort of an inexorable current of competition between Russia and China in Central Asia? Well, I think there's some argument to be made that some of these short-term convergences will be sticky. The gas investments, for example, if they come through, are sticky insofar as they create a mutual vulnerability. Russia will need China as an expanded natural gas export market, and China will need to import gas from Russia, especially if it implements successfully that shift to a natural gas economy I was talking about earlier. The cash investments in terms of propping up specific sanction targets will likely continue, and these may also lay the groundwork for longer-term deals. And also institutions, I think, will acquire a degree of stickiness. So the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, I think is becoming, or may become, a mutual source of real multilateral support, especially with India joining recently, which was surprising to many. And so that may function as a forum to work out a Central Asian modus vivendi, especially as the New Silk Road progresses between China and Russia. And I think this may even coexist with things like the EU, where Russia has its own sphere of influence, but the SCO is the place where they sort of hash out their differences over who gets what in Central Asia specifically. So why do we care about all this? Well, I think the first thing is that they've been successfully able to purge U.S. influence from the area. For example, most recently, there was a mutual advocacy for Afghani self-reliance, and besides the previous base kickouts, there are also Chinese language sources that somewhat worryingly say that the SCO might function in the future as a quasi-military alliance to veto a UN-based intervention and establish that regional security architecture. Secondly, obviously, they help to prop up authoritarian governments in the region. The three evils, as mentioned in the SCO, of terrorism, separatism, and extremism are often taken to mean democratic protest. In Uzbekistan, for example, the U.S. was booted, especially after our critique of their response to the citizen protests. And thirdly, and this is, for me at least, most worryingly, is that it might be a new NATO-like bloc for China. So with India, Pakistan, and Iran, the SCO actually has the world's two largest armies and 4, possibly 5, depending on Iran, nuclear weapon states, and also 43% of the world's population. And so if this actually came together as a new power block, it would be a substantial realignment of how the global map looks in terms of power. And this may also not be contained to Central Asia. For example, a lot of SCO exercises actually currently involve maritime operations, which are obviously irrelevant to Central Asia. Things like amphibious landings and blockade-breaking operations are obviously targeted at the United States. So it's not just a Central Asian security architecture. And so the imagination is, what if these lines are not of just of investment or trade, but this is actually the line of influence effectively between China and Russia. And obviously, finally, and I know Dr. Starr may have something to say about this, Afghanistan will be a key indicator as we look into the future. There are indications that it's currently leaning towards China. It borders Xinjiang. It's an observer state in the SCO. And Ashraf Ghani's first foreign trip was to China. He pledged to help China fight Islamic militants, including ITA, and pledged unconditional support on Taiwan, Tibet, the other issues, and China in return has pledged $327 million in aid to Afghanistan through 2017. Ghani has noted an active interest in joining the New Silk Road projects, and obviously this will increase post-withdrawal of ISAF forces by the end of this year. And so I think that will be a key indicator to look at whether China also gets more into the realm of security provision in Afghanistan and thus potentially comes into conflict with Russia in its traditional role. So in concluding, I would just say that I think there's an underlying geostrategic logic to China's march west and its New Silk Road, and it's a mistake to think that it's just purely for economic or commercial ends. And what's particularly interesting here is that there is a convincing parallel between its policies in Xinjiang and Central Asia. So publicly, there's heavy economic investment and rhetoric about a harmony of interests. But in actuality, I think they're focused on things like resource extraction, whether that be farmland and material and minerals or oil and gas, and also dealing with foreign influence, so respectively, the United States or with Russia. And so there's a two-level parallel here. And since they're currently using harsh means in Xinjiang, and it seems that we perhaps missed the signs of emerging Chinese assertiveness in East Asia, it may be worth getting ahead of the curve and recognizing them in Central Asia now. So thanks for listening.
Well, that is certainly a statement that is bound to and should elicit some comment, and the floor is now open. I'm ask you to introduce yourself and be very concise. Here comes a microphone.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Jeremy Furchgott. I completely agree with your perspective on non-commercial incentives or interests and resource extraction and the general geostrategic importance of these new alliances. But I'm a little puzzled about your dismissal of the Islamic threat in Xinjiang. You talk about foreign influences from the United States. What about foreign influences from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf region? I think you're probably right that ETIM isn't really up to much of anything if it exists. But if you go to Xinjiang, the average person on the ground loves anything that's Saudi, anything that comes from the traditional Middle East. Culturally, they're Middle Eastern essentially, and go around Xinjiang, people have pictures of Mecca as their cell phone background. They love getting anything that's imported from the Middle East. Borders are not particularly well sealed, despite China's best efforts. So what do you think about the threat of foreign influence coming from a traditional Middle Eastern and more perhaps radical Islam?
Thanks for your question. I think I actually still believe that the threat is not high in terms of the question of national strategy. So when Chinese strategists sit around a table and say, okay, what are the problems that we face? I don't think Uyghur unrest is very high on the list. And I think there is some worry of ideological, maybe, I don't know if contamination is the word, but I think the cultural similarities and influences don't necessarily translate into the type of structure that Uyghur militants would have to possess to create a genuine threat to the Chinese state. So it's true that obviously you will always have lots of low-level incidents of violence like knifings and the occasional bombing and so on and so forth. But in actuality, you have that all over China. You have lots of protests over various issues all over China. And the reason that China hypes up the threat in Xinjiang, I think, is because it gives it specific strategic benefits. And insofar as culture goes, yes, they may be culturally more similar, but I don't think that implies that they'll be able to set up a network of the sort that would enable them to mount large-scale opposition to the Chinese military, which is what would have to happen in order for China to consider them to be a genuine threat. Now, that may change as the march west and the New Silk Road continues, because that will increase the ideological exposure of Uyghurs. But I think the historical evidence and insofar as the points I just talked about show that it's sort of, they're still doing things like knife attacks, and that's not really the biggest security concern of China right now.
Anyone want to comment on on this response before we move on? Very brief, please.
Very briefly, an argument has been made that the Chinese government may be hyping up the Uyghur problem in order to use it to keep the potential Hui problem under control. In the early 20th century and late 19th centuries, the Hui caused a lot more problems than what were then the Turks and have now been called the Uyghurs. And one could make an argument that they're actually worried about Hui insurrection because the Hui are more, one might say, capable, or the Hui have a better history of organizing armies and holding territory than the Uyghurs. So I'm just putting that out there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I actually think that if the Hui were to become completely radicalized and organize themselves, it would be a much more genuine threat to China of a different order of magnitude than that of the Uyghur threat. But my impression, at least, is that the Hui are much better integrated into Chinese society and are therefore...
Why order of magnitude greater?
Well, I think order of magnitude because they have much more power, they have much more ability to upset Chinese society in a way that isn't contained to Xinjiang, contained to a place in which it's 46% Uyghur, yes, but it's also 40% Han, and you have this established XPCC, that map that was up earlier, already sort of paramilitary or actually military net in place to contain any large-scale unrest that may occur. It's sort of a spider's web across the region that, and I say it almost looks like what you would have for an occupying force, insofar as China views the Uyghurs as a genuine threat. But the Hui are not, contained to a convenient space in which there are predetermined security solutions like the Uyghurs are. And in general, since they're much more integrated into Chinese society and hold prominent positions in government, et cetera, at a much higher rate, they would be a much more substantial threat if the Hui as a class decided one day that they were out to get China.
Sir.
I'm Greg Fay from the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Just a few comments with regards to, the idea that the border of China's western border is very porous. Uyghur people, whereas we saw them 5-10 years ago, seeking refuge in through that border. Now we're seeing more routes taken through Southeast Asia because that border has become harder to cross. And in terms of Saudi influence, I think if you look at some of the regulations that are coming out of the region, it's really not. It's really long established religious practices that are being cracked down on. New regulations that were just released ban certain funerary practices, ban wedding practices. There's bans on cross-village religious worship. These are not foreign imported ideas. These are a long-standing part of Uyghur religious practice, which is not Saudi. It's Turkic. And then just in terms of your response, I think that the other reason why the Uyghur people are being kind of maligned in Chinese media is because the Chinese government does not want to see linkages between Chinese democracy activists and Uyghur democracy activists. I mean, I think that's the reason why the Uyghur scholar Ilham Tohti, whose kind of life work was creating a website that encouraged dialogue between Han Chinese and Uyghur thinkers, has been sentenced to life in prison for his work. 7 of his students were just sentenced today. I mean, the Chinese internet is very well contained. Uyghur people are extremely censored on the web. There isn't a great deal of communication with overseas kind of Islamic thinkers. Uyghur people who use the internet are frequently cracked down on.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for bringing up that point. It's not something that I got into the planned structure of the talk, and I encourage you all to look at this case of Ilham Tohti if you hadn't had a chance. It's really quite remarkable. The state charged him with inciting things like separatism, but if you look at the actual content of what he's talking about, it's mostly things like reporting on actual economic inequality in Xinjiang. Not anything radical that you would actually imagine China might send someone to life in prison for. In fact, there's a lot of Chinese abuse in the region that sort of seems almost absurd or tragicomic. For example, there are laws against people having beards. There are
Okay, why bother if your real purpose is geostrategic?
Okay, and here's
why, in other words,
yeah.
I mean, okay, fine, but if your other argument is correct, then you have to say, gee, they're wasting a lot of time on trivia.
Yes, and I'm going to make an argument that might be inflammatory to some, but I actually think that the reason for all of this sort of very exaggerated behavior, to the point that, for example, during Ramadan, they go around looking for people who are fasting, and then they go and force feed them, and sometimes there are lots of public executions of Uyghurs where they literally force everyone to watch and they execute them, is that China prefers, I think, Uyghur activists to be terrorists rather than activists. And this is for 2 reasons. And the first reason is that the United States or Western media, et cetera, is very sympathetic to activists, particularly, for example, the narrative of a Uyghur activist who's been oppressed by the state and is seeking religious freedom, et cetera. But we also have shown a definite willingness to sacrifice things like human rights in the favor of counterterrorism. So for China, they much prefer it from the standpoint of looking at the US for these people to be more radical or more radicalized relative to being activists. And the second reason is the one you brought up, which is that if they're more radicalized and more about their specific cause, then they can't link up with the other democracy activists in China.
No, I'm sorry, a second there.
Yeah, hi. Creighton Jones, 21st Century Science and Technology. Throughout your discussion, you often reference the perceived threat of a potential U.S. blockade or a perceived containment policy from the United States, as if that's not a real live policy coming from leading circles in the United States, right? It is an actual act of policy. So it's not just simply them reacting to a perceived threat, they're reacting to a real threat. So from a standpoint of a geopolitical zero-sum game, their reaction to that threat is legitimate from our own way of strategic thinking here in the U.S. We would react the same way to that same kind of perceived threat. Would you agree to that?
Well, I don't know if I would agree to the extent that I think obviously the way in which the United States policymaking system processes threats is probably different from the way in which the Chinese decision-making system processes threats. I agree with you that obviously the option of blockading China, et cetera, is something that is discussed in
Right,
a
so
lot
it's
in open source literatures and in policymaking circles, et
quite
cetera.
provocative.
I'm not passing moral judgment on Chinese decision makers as to whether they should react to this or not. I'm merely trying to argue for the thesis that a lot of people see this new Chinese behavior as purely economic, et cetera, at an end, and I wanted to argue that there's also a strategic dimension to it.
Okay, so then I would counter, though, that there is an alternative option. There is an option whereby the U.S. could collaborate and work with China for a mutual benefit, that there really can be a mutual benefit. And you see this, for example, the press conference that Xi did with Obama after the G20, where he said, this is an inclusive policy. We want the U.S. to join with us as part of the maritime and also the Eurasian Silk Road policy. And they've done this in the context of pushing a very optimistic approach to, for example, space exploration, with what we've seen with their moon program and with their open arm policy towards collaboration with U.S. science, space science, fusion, and nuclear science. So I think that's a very real and genuine offer on the part of the Chinese. And the shift really has to occur not in China, but here in the United States, to get outside of the paradigm of geopolitical thinking
Okay, I
that
think
it's
your
zero
point-
sum,
your
but there
point's
can be
made.
collaboration.
But-
So could you comment on that
But
idea?
I don't want to get into a general foreign policy discussion because that's beyond our concern here today, for better or for worse. I'd like to shift something that actually feeds on your first question, and that is you have, by coming back now the third time to this map, it gives a tremendous sense of deliberation, if you remember ever see the famous Soviet film of Stalingrad, Battle of Stalingrad, it starts with a tremendous lot of noise and sort of very impressive music, and then there's a map, and then you see a huge finger come down from the sky and touch Stalingrad, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is really big, and this is where deliberate forces come together. That was the purpose of the film. Now, by showing this map, you don't have big fingers coming down, but the implication is similar. Namely, there is big strategy at work here, and what's going on both in Xinjiang and in Central Asia is the consequence overwhelmingly of big strategy, whatever it is, on the Chinese side. Now, let me pose an opposite question, that in terms of the economic expansion into, not the railroads, there I agree, but a lot of other activity, both in Xinjiang and Central Asia, that the Chinese government doesn't really control it. That this is happening through a lot of spontaneous entrepreneurial and activist forces within China, and it's having very complicated effects and so on that no one is quite sure how to react to. Now, I'm not asserting this as the way it is. I'm saying this is another logical hypothesis that you have not considered, and it seems to me has to be weighed against your big finger in Beijing coming and moving all this. The implication, to the extent that this is at all true, this other hypothesis, is very curious, and that is it's much less controllable than if it were all the result of Chinese deliberation policy.
Thanks for that alternative hypothesis. I think that that obviously touches on the broader question often debated in literature of whether Chinese decision-making is pluralized or whether it's all Xi Jinping.
But again, I'm not
scheming
even,
out
yes, and I'm not even talking about pluralized decision-making. I'm talking about a whole lot of people making a lot of investment and entrepreneurial decisions and so on, which are at best very poorly coordinated and maybe not even at all really directed by the state.
I would agree were it not for a few things. And the first is that this is sort of a policy which has coherent form in both Chinese literature and in Xi's announcement himself. I mean, he has said, this is the new Silk Road, this is how we're going to do it, and then it proceeds to be done. It's discussed in the Chinese literature, often under the term 马出西进战略, and people say this is how we're going to do it, and then it's done in a way that is strategically coherent. So the first argument I would make against what you just said is that it's strategically coherent. China said they would do this, there's clear geostrategic benefits, and then they did it. And the second thing is that there's repetition of this kind of policy, which is the combination of heavy economic investment, public rhetoric about harmony of convergence of interests, and then privately, or if you examine the actual facts on the ground, it seems that there is an actual geostrategic purpose to a lot of Chinese actions in that area. And I think you see that in Xinjiang, you see that in Central Asia, and you also see that in South Asia, for example, with China's behavior towards India. But obviously that's somewhat off topic. And I think the third thing is, as I pointed out during the presentation, a lot of it is unprofitable. A lot of what China is doing, despite it being under centralized state control, so if Xi wanted, he could approve or disapprove of each investment, and on the order of billions of dollars being lost to build various infrastructures seems to be decidedly of a strategic nature. Otherwise, why would it be happening?
Good. Okay, I just want to keep pressing you here one step further, and that is, you've spoken about Xinjiang and Central Asia. Pull back at a, again, as a little greater distance, and tell us what you think are the essential differences in anything, if anything, between what China is doing within its sovereign territory, within Xinjiang, and its activities in Central Asia. Are there essential differences, or are the similarities more overwhelming in your view?
Well, I think obviously there are lots of differences on an administrative technical level. I think the interesting thing is the parallels on a sort of grand strategic level. But obviously the major difference between Chinese execution of the strategy I just outlined in Xinjiang and Central Asia is that in Xinjiang they can afford to be much more brazen about it, right? Because no one seriously contests that Xinjiang is not a part of China. That's not a real question. And so there's much more active military suppression of the elements they don't like. Whereas if they were still wanted to carry out this policy of gaining strategic investments via infrastructure to extract valuable resources and so on in Central Asia, they aren't obviously going to march in with the XBCC and carry out public executions and look for people wearing beards and shoot them in the head. And so I think the overtness of the policy differs, but I think that if it's true, if my hypothesis is correct, that there's a similar sort of grand strategy being executed in both, then looking at what is overt in Xinjiang is useful for analyzing what may be intended or what may be the driving strategic factors in Central Asia.
Good. Yes, sir, down here. And then.
My name is Ethan Marin. Very quick observation and quick question, I promise, on both counts. Observation, part of your hypothesis, if I understand you correctly, sir, rests on the observation that a lot of the investment in Central Asia is unprofitable. And just to play devil's advocate, so what? There are plenty of companies in Western democracies that make either simply bad business decisions, they've messed up, or sometimes even mess up consistently, or they make decisions that are unprofitable in the short term in the hopes that, maybe it'll pay off in the future, and it's a risk. It's a long-term investment. If you could speak to that, I'd be very interested. My question, though, is whether this larger-scale Central Asian investment is the result of coherent political strategy or a lot of individual private actors just working in a coincidental direction. If we agree that this is fundamentally bad for American interests because it reduces Chinese vulnerability to a naval blockade, my question then becomes, is there anything we can do realistically to reverse this trend? Is there anything we can do to foul the works? Or is this just something we can observe and bemoan, but it's a situation we have very little influence over? Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for your questions. I think part of the question is similar to what Dr. said earlier, so I'll try not to address that part as much. But I think in terms of your point, obviously, that a lot of companies make losing investments, and that doesn't imply that there's some nefarious scheme behind them, et cetera. But I think in this case, there's a couple reasons to think that there may be a strategic underpinning. The first is just the pure extent of the unprofitability, right? So, for example, 99% presently of trade between Central Asia and between Europe and China, as I mentioned, is by sea and not by Central Asia. So, I mean, just the amount of capital required to develop a viable trading route is staggering. The losses are in the order of billions, 6-7 billion in the case of just PetroChina. That's one national oil company operating in a capacity in Central Asia, and et cetera. And you see this pattern not only in Central Asia, but also in places like Myanmar with the pipeline, and et cetera, and so on. And in each case, there's also an easily identifiable strategic reason to do the investment. So I think this combination of factors tilts the balance towards there likely being a strategic motive rather than the companies just being really bad at this, especially since Chinese companies do make profits in a lot of other spheres.
Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Mike Billington with Executive Intelligence Review. To follow up on that first question, let me extend it a bit, because a lot of your argument rests on the idea, sort of a structure you set up, that investments are either for profit or they're for strategic, implied aggressive purposes. But in fact, especially, and let me look at it both domestically and internationally from China's perspective. Domestically, their oil imports and so forth are aimed at uplifting the nation's productivity as a whole. And it's based very much on the kind of principle you had with Franklin Roosevelt in the United States. The investments into the TVA and the infrastructure were not profitable in the short term. And it wasn't just hoping for profit, it was the idea that you're uplifting the entire platform of the nation, the productivity of the nation, through infrastructure, through having the energy, having the water resources, which don't return immediate profits. But I think you can extend that to a global perspective as well, of the sort we talked about before the meeting, which is that if you look at Africa, for instance, and Central Asia, the investments there, unlike the imperial investments in the 19th century, are not just to extract raw materials. They need lots of raw materials, but their investments are to help nation building. They're building power, they're building connecting railroads, they're building cross-continental railroads, they're investing in the kind of infrastructure that the West no longer invests in. We say we don't do infrastructure in the third world. They do, but it's because they're creating true partners and sovereign states. That is what I would pose you have to respond to.
Okay. The first thing is, I guess I would disagree on the nature of Chinese investment in places like Africa. I think if you read the reports, there's a lot of concern over exploitative labor practices by.
Those are not developmental.
Well, I think it reflects more on the developmental overall logic of Chinese investment in these areas, which is for things because places like Africa have valuable resources or offer opportunities for employment of Chinese workers instead of employment of local workers, which would probably be more the case if these were really aimed at this altruistic vein of enriching other countries, which I honestly just don't think China is particularly interested, for example, in uplifting Africa for altruistic reasons. As for your the harking back to Roosevelt, I think given that there are alternatives to ship oil by routes by sea, the reason why you would undertake unprofitable investment in things like land routes and et cetera does have to have a strategic logic. Oil is oil. It's fungible within itself. And the reason for preferring a route over the other has to either be profitability or have a strategic imperative.
Yes, and back, and then over here.
Alexander Melikishvili, thank you very much for your very informative presentation. I have one question that goes into the crux of your argument. You basically are saying that one belt, one road policy will eventually contain a military dimension, right? If that is correct, if that is the argument that you're advancing, then do you mind giving us an outlook by when it is supposed to acquire that military dimension, by either what you were saying earlier, by the extension of this sort of civilian corps that is currently deployed in Xinjiang, or by any other means? Because surely there will be some sort of indications prior to that. And related to this is another question, which also goes back to your argument. If you are arguing that what we are witnessing right now is basically a geopolitical concept of condominium between Russia and China in Central Asia, don't you think by the time this one road policy will acquire military dimension from the Chinese point of view, don't you think that will create tensions with Moscow? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So obviously those two scenarios are sort of in conflict, and I don't say one is going to definitely happen or the other is going to definitely happen. Obviously, if China becomes more militarized in Central Asia, Russia will have an issue with that, and I think that's an indicator to watch in terms of tracking the China-Russia situation. As to when it will happen specifically, I obviously can't, give you a year definitively, but I think in terms of indicators to look for, I think the first thing is if there's a major incident involving Chinese workers deployed abroad, because all of these Chinese projects are obviously, as you know, mostly staffed with Chinese workers. And so if there's a major attack on them, say from a local Central Asian population, then that could be a trigger by which China, if it does have an intent to militarize its activities in the area, to deploy the XPCC or similar troops abroad to project its workers. The second is if there is an internal scenario of unrest. So a lot of these Central Asian states, as I'm sure you're aware, are very fragile in terms of their governance structures. So if there's a succession crisis, for example, I don't know, if Karimov passes away and there's not a clear succession plan laid out and there's a big internal crisis. Obviously, Russia doesn't have a great track record on intervening in these internal states and stabilizing them, for example, see Bakiev. And then there was an interesting report of a meeting between Chinese and Russian counterparts last year, which was leaked even though the meeting was under Chatham House rules. And to some effect, the Chinese representative said, oh, to the Russian representative, we know that Central Asia is your backyard, but if it's your backyard, you have to water the plants and take care of the flowers. So the implication is that if it is the case that China ever more feels that it has a national interest in the stability of Central Asia, and it believes that Russia is no longer able to provide that stability, then it may feel compelled to move in a more aggressive fashion to become that provisioner of security.
Ben, let me interject a historical reality here. You are speaking about all this as if it was basically conjured up in the last couple of years, because that's when most of the fancy talk about new Silk Roads and so on has come. In fact, though, the opening of the transit routes to the west, both within Xinjiang, the railroad to Kashgar, and then the rail routes across Kazakhstan, were all conjured up in the early 1990s. This happened very quickly after the fall of the USSR, before any of what you're talking about on the as a motivator on the sea was present. Now, it is a reality. I attended some of these meetings. There was a tremendous battle between China and Russia in the 90s because Russia wanted all the transport to the west to be routed north over the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and China quite
Part of that had to do with the Russian rivalry. Part of it also had to do that Xinjiang was effectively disconnected from the rest of China,
Yep.
and that China was very concerned about 1/6 of its territory just disappearing into the hands of the Russians or the British. So, a lot of the latest high-speed train line connecting Lanzhou to Xinjiang is really exactly the same idea of the initial motor road that Sven Hedin in the 1930s proposed to the Nanjing government. So it's really the same thing that's been happening in terms of transportation infrastructure in the last 80 years. And then you have the parallel train line that's going to go through northern Qinghai, through the Caidam down to Ruoqiang. It's the same things in the past 80 years. And another point is you alluded several times to the sensitivity that the Chinese government places on Xinjiang and the general aura of secrecy that clouds this province.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is nothing new. This goes back at least to the 19th century, where foreign travelers were harassed or prevented from entering the province. Conditions there were very different. Much of the Western literature about Xinjiang dates from either the past 10 years or 15 years or from before the 1930s. There's this massive gap from the 1940s to the 1980s because the Chinese government hasn't let anyone in. So how do you explain that? There's something else going on. And in terms of the trade issue, that's also been going on for a while. And there's some interesting material on late 19th century trade patterns between India and Russia and China, and sort of the economic aspect of the great game, as it's called.
Yeah.
So a lot of these trends are old, even though, as you know, the cash infusion is definitely remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I should be clear here, and I apologize if I haven't been clear. I don't disagree that things like the Lanzhou-Urumqi Railway or infrastructure within China, etc., that obviously these ideas, as Dr. Starr correctly noted, have been around forever, have reasons other than a high-level geopolitical competition with the United States to be put into practice. What I'm arguing against is the thesis that the new wave of Chinese investments and the new wave of Chinese policy action up at the highest level, which seems to be taking a whole government approach, is either purely for economic ends or intended as actually a de-escalatory measure vis-a-vis the United States. But I don't disagree that a lot of these measures obviously have strong historical roots. But I don't think that that's competitive or mutually exclusive with the idea that now they can be also viewed in a light that strategically benefits China vis-a-vis the United States.
I wish we had more time. Just two notes in ending. First of all, it's funny about this New Silk Road term. It was borrowed from Hillary Clinton's Chennai speech and the American Initiative, which in turn came from a publication we issued here in 2008 from a conference in 2005. Now, I raise this because, you know, it's a funny term, the Silk Road. It was invented in the mid-19th century by a German, actually the uncle of, I think, or great-uncle of Baron von Richthofen, who was the guy that Snoopy the Red Baron was always dealing with. It's not a historical term at all. And the curious thing about China's trade with the West, if you look over 2,000 years and not, first it was very, very frequently interrupted. It was not something continuous. It's very interesting. It would go on for a couple of hundred years and then stop for hundreds. Second, it carried very few ideas. It was not a cultural transmission belt. There were far more ideas in cultural habits went east than went west. Third, the Chinese didn't do it. The Chinese brought goods to the border and dropped them there, and basically Central Asians picked them up and carried them from there. Now, why do this is, you know, maybe just curious historical details that don't really pertain to anything. I don't think we should assume yet that this whole thing is real. Yes, infrastructure is being built. Yes, infrastructure was built when they built the watchtowers all across Xinjiang. And you know, these are 2,000 years old. But the reality is, even as late as 49, Xinjiang was 99% Turkic and Muslim. It was cut off from the rest of China, really. Why do I mention this? That building infrastructure is only part of the story. And it's not yet clear, maybe it will be clear, that this will fulfill all these expectations we're talking about. But I think a bit of caution is in order. Furthermore, before we get too excited about this, it's worth getting excited about. This is a real breakthrough. Instead of just having one northern east-west corridor across Eurasia through Russia in the form of the late 19th century Trans-Siberian Railroad, we'll now have two. We'll have a middle corridor that connects China in the west, which it's got to be a plus. But at the same time, there's going to be a southern corridor. And no talk about this existed until post 9/11. Why? Because this corridor, which went really from, in the minimum, it went from India to the Middle East and to Europe, and it went from India east all the way to the Pacific. This corridor couldn't be reopened after the collapse of the Soviet Union because of the Taliban. It went right through Afghanistan. Now, this corridor, this southern corridor, A, it's longer. B, it's older, much older than the China link west. C, it was practically never interrupted. D, it carried far more cultural goods in both directions, including decimal system, negative numbers, and so on. And finally, it was conducted by everyone. The Indians actually worked the whole length of the route, all the way to the west. I can show you where their trading offices 800 years ago were in Baku and places like that. So this now is we're not talking about it. We're not talking about it at all. The Chinese aren't talking about it much either. And the Indians, Modi is still looking east at this point. They haven't picked this up again, but they will because they have full plans to. It's huge infrastructure. As big as what has been from the Chinese Silk Road infrastructure, actually bigger investment has been made, not is going to be made, has been made in the southern corridor. We're talking about the new road and railroad across India. We're talking about all the Chinese-built roads and railroads in both directions, east, west, north, south in Pakistan. We're talking about the huge American investment in transport with some Indian in Afghanistan. We're talking about the immense investment by Turkmenistan in a new road and railroad all the way across Turkmenistan, Turkmen investment in a huge new port at Turkmenbashi being built by the Turks. We're talking about a huge new port across the Caspian at Baku, totally new, being built by, again, with a Turkish company for the Azeris. We're talking about the new road and railroad from then that goes all the way to Istanbul and under the Bosphorus Strait to Europe, or if you want to put it on containers and you then take the new Viking Railroad and you from the Black Sea through Ukraine and you end up at Klaipėda in Lithuania. Now, this is real, and it connects with the western part of it, from the Caspian on, connects exactly with the Chinese project. Now, when we're doing the big geostrategic thinking, who is going to control the southern corridor? How will China play a role in that? If so, what role? Will it connect in a productive way with the central corridor, or will it be competitive? They all come together in Baku. How will that work? What role will Iran choose to play in this game? What I'm suggesting, Ben, in this really excellent and extremely interesting report you've given us, is that your first and last map shows something very important, but only part of the picture. And I think maybe the Chinese aren't thinking about this bigger picture. Maybe the Indians aren't. We aren't, but we all should, because this could be either very, very good, and it could have a mollifying effect, a softening effect, a commercializing effect on the middle corridor. It could make it less of a geostrategic and more of an economic project, and so we don't know. But in ending, let me say on behalf of all of us, Ben, that our effort here is not to expound a dogma of any sort, but rather to have truly intelligent and well-researched and provocative presentations that will enable this wonderful group of participants who come to our forums to sound off and present their views and challenge whatever is offered from the podium. And you've done a really splendid job in making that possible today, and we thank you.
Thank you.